The North African desert in World War II was not only the stage for tank battles, artillery duels, and the strategic mind games between Rommel and Montgomery. It was also the battleground of a quieter but far more devastating struggle. The fight to save every drop of fuel against the brutality of the climate and the Allied forces' own logistical shortcomings. Each morning, when the blazing red sun rose above the horizon, heat shimmered off the sand as if trying to swallow everything whole, and each night, the temperature plunged to near freezing. That brutal swing turned the fuel cans the Allies brought into Africa into countless tiny bombs that leaked constantly, spilling precious fuel into the sand before anyone could stop it. In the rear areas, where fuel depots lay hundreds of kilometers from the front, logistics officers calculated their numbers with a palpable sense of despair. Some places recorded that 70,000 gallons of gasoline had been sent out full, yet only 30,000 arrived at the front, a loss of 57%. And still, the officer in charge reported that this was a good result, not because he underestimated the loss, but because he knew that under these conditions, 57% was still far better than elsewhere. That stark truth exposed a painful reality. The war was being lost already at the supply lines, even before the convoys reached the battlefield. When Richard M. Daniel, a chemical engineer sent to Egypt by the U.S. War Department in September 1942, first set foot on this dusty land, he believed he would find a few technical problems solvable with simple adjustments, but what he witnessed shattered all such assumptions. Daniel had come to investigate fuel losses in the campaign against Ramillies Africa Corps, but he quickly realized the situation was far worse than Washington had reported. British supply units stated that fuel losses on the journey from port to front ranged from 30 to 40%, in a theater where every drop of gasoline could decide victory or defeat. Those numbers were unacceptable. The first thing Daniel noticed was the misery of British soldiers, who had to use a flimsy type of fuel container, so accurately named flimsies. These flimsy cans were 4-gallon tin containers with soft soldered seams that easily split, deformed, and almost inevitably leaked under heavy vibration or high temperatures. A well-known war correspondent at the time, Alan Moorhead, wrote that simply placing a few flimsies on a truck bed and driving for a few hours over rocky tracks was enough to smell gasoline seeping out. That smell was the omen of the fuel that would vanish before it ever reached the front line. Worse still, flimsies were designed as single-use containers. Many were packed in wooden crates, later replaced by planked boxers and even cardboard, making them even weaker. Once emptied, most were discarded by the roadside or buried in the sand, forming literal fields of useless scrap. They were impossible to reuse, and certainly untrustworthy for long-distance transport. The Americans were not much better off. Despite their formidable industry, they relied on designs dating back to World War I. Heavy, bulky 5-gallon cans with screw caps and rubber gascots that required both a wrench and a funnel to open. The 55-gallon drums were so impractical that they were useful only in stationary depots. To pour from them required pumps, manpower, and time. In the desert, where delay could mean an entire unit running dry, such equipment was little more than self-imposed shackles that Daniel saw with his own eyes. Gasoline soaking into the hot sand, while soldiers wrestled with deformed tins. Men struggled with containers that were difficult to open, often needing people just to pour fuel into a vehicle, and with almost no guarantee that the needed amount would ever arrive where it was supposed to. As a chemical engineer, Daniel understood very clearly that gasoline evaporates extremely quickly when exposed, and, in North Africa's arid heat, the evaporation rate was many times higher. This meant that even the tiniest crack caused enormous losses. Amid the chaos, Daniel sent a telegram back to Washington that he later admitted was deliberately exaggerated to ring the alarm bells. He estimated fuel losses at 40% altogonly, an approximation. It was not far from the truth. The British reported 30%, with some cases reaching as high as 57%, and all parties confirmed that a logistical crisis was suffocating Allied operations. Meanwhile, a bitter truth unfolded before the Allied officers. Despite all their hardships, the Germans did not suffer fuel losses on the same scale. Whenever British or American troops captured Wehrmacht supply dumps, they saw green fuel cans, still intact, no rust, no dents, no leaks, and immediately usable. These containers, later known worldwide as jerrycans, quickly became items Allied soldiers coveted like gold. They collected them, guarded them, begged for them, even hid them for use in critical missions. Some specialized units, like the Long-Range Desert Group, had completely switched to German jerrycans by early 1942 because they were simply too good to ignore. And in that moment, amid the scorched desert, the crushed flimsies, and the fuel-starved trucks, Richard M., Daniel, and many Allied logistics officers finally understood something they should have realized 3 years earlier. This war was not only being lost on the battlefield, but also at the very beginning of the journey logistics. Amid the fuel starvation strangling every Allied effort in North Africa, a small yet strangely remarkable object gradually became the subject of intense discussion in forward headquarters: a red or green steel fuel can with 3 handles on top, an embossed X-shaped, reinforcing ribs across its sides, like the carved lines of a metal artisan. At first, it appeared only sporadically among the spoils captured from the Germans' discarded and burned-out convoys, lying beside destroyed panzers, or snatched up in the chaos of battle. But the more they observed it and tried using it, the more Allied engineers and logistics officers realized they were dealing with something far beyond their own standards, a product in which every detail had been engineered with total war thinking. And so they began calling it by a simple name, tinged with envy: the jerrycan, the German fuel can. To understand why such a small fuel container could make the entire Allied logistics apparatus covet it, copy it, and fight one another for every single one, we must turn back to Germany in the 1930s, when war had not yet erupted but its shadow already blanketed Europe. In preparing for a conflict they believed was inevitable, the Nazis launched sweeping reforms in the military and industrial sectors. This did not manifest only in heavy weapons like the Tiger, the Bf-109, or the U, but even in the most mundane necessities, such as a fuel can. To the Germans, logistics was not the final chore of war, it was the foundation of every victory. A poorly designed can, a weak seam, a cap that opened too slowly, any of these could cripple the mechanized army they were painstakingly building. In 1937, the German Ministry of Defense issued a requirement to develop a standardized fuel container for all branches of the military. The specifications were so demanding that several factories initially refused to participate. The can had to withstand extreme temperatures from the North African desert to the Russian winter. It had to open and close quickly. It had to be completely leak-proof. It had to stack efficiently on trucks. It had to be portable by hand in all conditions. And, most importantly, it had to be mass-producible without sacrificing quality. After dozens of prototypes and numerous destructive tests, a final design emerged, and this was the fuel container that would become an icon of German logistics throughout the war. The outward appearance of the jerrycan was merely a shell for a truly ahead-of-its-time idea. The 3 handles on top, seemingly excessive, were in fact a stroke of design genius. 2 people could carry a full can together. 1 person could quickly shift grip while running, and when stacked, the handles formed gaps that made pulling, lifting, and passing cans far easier. The X-shaped ribs were not decorative. They prevented deformation when the can was struck or dropped. These ribs distributed force evenly, keeping the body from bulging or denting as temperatures fluctuated. Inside, an anti-corrosion coating similar in formulation to the lining of a milk container prevented fuel oxidation, sediment buildup, and most importantly, protected the steel from being eaten away, allowing the can to remain airtight even after thousands of kilometers of service. Yet the true brilliance of the jerrycan lay in an almost invisible feature: the method used to weld its body. Instead of rolled seams or cold welds, like most manufacturers, the Germans employed a deep penetration weld that created a continuous, flexible seam capable of expanding and contracting with temperature changes without cracking. This seam was the heart of the can's perfect seal, something the Allies understood only much later. The cam lever locking cap opened, and seconds combined with an integrated breather tube allowed fuel to flow quickly and smoothly, instead of the glug-glug, choking common with British and American cans. It was a small detail, but in war, the time spent refueling could decide life or death. Even a minute delay while topping up a supply truck could leave an entire convoy trapped under artillery fire. For the Germans, the jerrycan was not just a tool, it was the pulse of their entire war machine. Every panzer division had tens of thousands of them. Every supply convoy carried long rows of red canisters stacked like bricks. In many wartime photographs, you can even spot soldiers using jerrycans as chairs, as steps, as supports, or even as makeshift flotation devices when crossing streams. Their durability exceeded every military standard of the era. This is why, when British and American troops first got their hands on these cans, they felt as though they had discovered an artifact from another world, something so good it was hard to believe the enemy possessed it. Allied logistics officers immediately sent reports up the chain of command. These reports were eerily consistent. The German jerrycan is vastly superior to any fuel can we possess. Field data only reinforced the disparity. While British flimsies leaked up to 40% of their fuel in American cans warped in the sun, German jerrycans remained virtually unaffected. Cans grazed by bullets could still be used. Cans dropped from a 1.5-meter truck bed stayed sealed. Meanwhile, Allied cans sometimes popped their caps or split seams from even mild impacts. The Allied craving for jerrycans evolved beyond preference into obsession. Special units prioritized capturing German cans. Many officers even ordered that they be retained at all costs. In some areas, American soldiers painted white stars on captured German cans and used them as their own. But all of this was only a temporary fix. To sustain thousands of vehicles in long campaigns, they did not need a few cans, they needed millions. And so, a new decision was made. Copy the German design. But soon, they would discover that they had only copied the shape, the soul of the design. When the need for a reliable fuel container became urgent, the Americans finally had a chance to examine the German standard design firsthand. This happened in the early 1940s, just before the United States officially entered World War II. A German engineer working for a humanitarian organization in Berlin who had driven countless relief missions across Europe kept a jerrycan in his vehicle as a backup. Anticipating the coming war, he secretly made 3 fully finished copies. One to leave in Germany, one to flee Europe with in his relief truck, and a third to send directly to the home of an American friend near Berlin. When the engineer eventually escaped to Switzerland and then to the United States, he brought the second can with him and handed it to the U.S. military, saying, "You should take a look at this." Suddenly, America possessed 2 original jerrycans before a single shot had been fired at Germany. It was the perfect opportunity to make a flawless copy. U.S. Army engineers immediately disassembled the can, measuring steel thickness, inspecting the internal coating, analyzing the ribs, the handles, the locking mechanism. Everything was replicated with near-perfect precision. When the completed blueprint was submitted, it became one of the most successful reverse engineering efforts in military history. The American jerrycan was almost a 100% match to the German original. In terms of production capability, American industry could manufacture millions of units within months. In theory, the Allies' catastrophic fuel leakage problem was on the verge of being solved. But then something unexpected happened. When the design was passed to manufacturing contractors, a decision one that seemed reasonable for reducing costs and speeding production ruined the entire value of the can. It was made by people who had never served on the front line, never refueled under gunfire, never seen supply troops killed because they lost a few minutes filling a truck. To them, it was just a bent sheet of steel and a weld seam, and they assumed a small change wouldn't matter. They were wrong. Instead of using the deep penetration, continuous weld of the German Dezina, weld that fused into the steel to form a perfectly sealed unit, the Americans switched to rolled seams. Why? Cheaper, faster, easier to produce, with American industrial lines. What they failed to realize was that rolled seams only held up under stable conditions in North African deserts or European battlefields, where temperatures could swing more than 40 degrees in a day, where trucks jolted over rough terrain, and where impacts were constant. Those seams began forming tiny gaps too small for the naked eye to detect. But even a gap the width of a razor blade was enough for fuel to start leaking, first as damp spots, then as streaks, then turning the entire can into something that smelled like it had been bathed in gasoline. Worst of all, the flaw was invisible. In normal inspection, at the factory, everything looked perfect. Only when placed on a truck under 48 degrees Celsius desert heat in Libya, or thrown from a truck bed during a rushed resupply, did the seam split. The Germans had accounted for that. From the beginning, they designed for real war. The Americans designed for war on paper, not on relied. The Americans also omitted the integrated vent pipe inside the German cap. Their cap looked similar, but the ventilation system didn't function smoothly, causing fuel to pour out uninterrupted. Choking glug-glug bursts that wasted time. On the battlefield, where supply trucks had to fill dozens of cans during the night to move before sunrise, every minute lost was a costly one. But the designers didn't understand this. Tesowit asked just a little slower. Reports from the front began pouring in. Troops complained that American cans dented isoli bulkhead easily and leaked ice. Many units openly stated, "If you find a German jerry can, use it. If not, pray you don't have to use an American one." Some soldiers even stole or bartered for German cans, painting white stars on them to use as American equipment. Thousands of supply trucks in the Tunisia campaign lost hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel simply because their cans leaked quietly throughout the journey. In one case, a convoy carrying 100,000 gallons arrived with only 40,000 lost. Not to enemy action, but to the cans themselves draining away their own cargo. American logistics was powerful, but not powerful enough to absorb that level of waste. And the thing that drove the generals mad was not the loss itself, but the cruel irony of it. They had possessed the perfect design. They had 2 original German cans. They had copied every visible detail with near perfection, but one small change, one invisible detail in the welding method, something no one paid attention to, caused it all to collapse. And so the Americans had to live with a bitter truth. They did not lose because they lacked the jerrycan. They lost because they turned a perfect design into a flawed one. A single decision made at a desk could cripple an entire battlefield. And the United States learned that lesson in the hardest possible way. When the American version of the jerrycan began arriving on the battlefield in large numbers, people hoped it would finally end the fuel loss nightmare that had been choking entire campaigns. But then, reports from North Africa, Italy, and even Britain started pouring in, carrying an increasingly undeniable truth. The fuel crisis had not ended, it had become worse, broader, and far more dangerous. At that point, Allied command could no longer dismiss it as a technical issue. It had grown into a prolonged crisis, silently crippling the efficiency of a massive war machine. The first thing that drove commanders mad was the sheer scale of fuel loss. In Tunisia, supply convoys left depots with 70,000 gallons, yet by the time they reached frontline units, fewer than 30,000 remained. Fuel leaked from rolled seams, loose caps, and joints that expanded and contracted under extreme heat, leaving long wet streaks across dusty roads. At times, German scouts could follow fresh gasoline trails to track the direction of American supply convoys. A British Lieutenant Colonel bitterly wrote in a report, "The Germans don't need to destroy our supply convoys. We destroy ourselves on the way." But fuel loss was only half the tragedy. The other half was time. Wito? Hat. An integrated vent tube. The fuel flow was uneven, turning the act of pouring gasoline into a nightmare. In the darkness of the desert where headquarters had to refuel at night to avoid German aircraft, erratic glue of American cans became the sound of delay and helplessness. A single supply truck might carry 40 or 50 cans. A small team might handle hundreds. A few seconds lost per pour, multiplied by thousands, meant entire operations could be delayed by hours, and in mechanized warfare, an hour of delay could determine victory or defeat. This slowness triggered a chain reaction. Supply trucks left depots later, reached front lines later. Tanks waited longer for fuel. Fast-moving formations lost their synchronization, throwing carefully laid plans off balance. Allied commanders slowly realized that they weren't short on gasoline, they were losing time, the most precious resource in war. Frontline units began improvising desperate solutions. Some wrapped wet cloth around cans seems to reduce leakage. Others plastered mud onto cracks. Some units simply relegated American cans to carrying water or engine oil, while Gasolinfahrt Valiaba was reserved strictly for German cans. Original Wehrmacht jerry cans became prized treasures. Anyone who had one felt blessed. American and British soldiers willingly crossed battlefields to retrieve them from destroyed German vehicles. Some units even painted Allied insignia on captured German cans, treating them as national assets. What made the crisis even more infuriating was the High Command's initial response. 4 months. Frontline reports were stamped, not important, under review or responsibility of the transport unit. Engineers in the rear continued to insist the American design was within standards, that no issues appeared. Under testing. They tested in factories, at stable temperatures, in clean environments, completely divorced from the hellish mix of dust, shock, heat, and brutal terrain at the front. Experienced logistics officers soon recognized a deeper problem. Fuel cans weren't just containers, they were the bloodstream of mechanized warfare. Without fuel, tanks were just steel hulks, trucks were inert blocks of metal, and self-propelled guns were abandoned artillery pieces. Yet this obvious reality was ignored for far too long by people who believed faster production mattered more than correct production. Worse still, the consequences spilled into tactics. Because of fuel loss, the Allies were often forced into reactive positions, unable to execute deep thrusts or sweeping maneuvers they otherwise excelled at. To compensate, they had to run more supply troops, raising the risk of ambush, overworking vehicles, draining manpower, and consuming even more time. Many meticulously planned operations had to be scaled back simply because they couldn't guarantee stable fuel levels. All of this because of one decision on paper about how to weld steel. The sad part was that even when the truth became undeniable, it still took time for people to admit the mistake, partly due to industrial pride, partly because no one wanted to be the one to declare an entire production chain flawed. But war waits for no one. The truth carved itself deeper each day, as convoys arrived at the front with tanks emptier than expected. Eventually, even the most stubborn officials were forced to face the inescapable. The Germans understood war better than the Allies had assumed, and the jerry can was not a product of luck, but of precise, total system thinking. Even more painful was the fact that the Allies had held the entire lesson in their hands yet ignored one of the most crucial parts, allowing the consequences to spread across years of conflict. From gasoline streaks on desert roads to delayed convoys, from wet seams, around leaky cans. 2 tanks, waiting helplessly for resupply. This fuel crisis became a razor-sharp reminder of a simple truth. Ignore one small detail, and an entire war machine can crumble from within. As supply convoys continued struggling with leaking fuel cans, gasoline dripping across desert sands, while Sherman, Crusader, and Grant tanks sat halted, waiting for every precious drop, logistics officers were finally forced to confront the question they had avoided for 2 years. Why didn't Nazi Germany have this problem? The answer had been right in front of them all along, visible in the jerry cans that Allied troops scavenged, hid under vehicles, strapped to turrets, or even fought over on the battlefield. They were living proof of an inconvenient truth. The enemy had done better, and because one tiny detail had been overlooked, the war machine of the good guys was paying the price. The official investigation began when reports from North Africa, Malta, Sicily, and Italy all pointed to the same issue. American fuel cans didn't just leak, they leaked systematically. Cracks always formed along the rolled seam, where the steel was folded and compressed into 2 layers without any weld securing the structure. Under blistering daytime heat, the metal expanded, and the seam opened into a razor-thin gap. At night, when the temperature dropped, the gap closed again, trapping grains of sand and moisture inside, creating microscopic corrosion points. Repeating this cycle hundreds of times slowly but surely killed the can. A welding defect could be repaired. A design flaw once multiplied into millions was a catastrophe. What truly stunned engineers and officers alike was the next discovery. The Germans had known all of this since 1936. Muller's laboratory, test drop, tests, crush tests, heating and cooling cycles had proven that only X-shaped resistance welding could provide absolute structural integrity under thermal stress. The X pattern wasn't for aesthetics. It was the load-bearing spine, dispersing pressure as fuel expanded. The Allies saw the X and copied it, but they had no idea that beneath each rib was a hidden seam of weld, sunk below the surface to protect it from impact, and that was the true technological heart of the jerry can. When this truth reached Washington and London, the first reaction wasn't anger, it was silence. The silence of people who realized that a flawed boardroom decision made 2 years earlier had forced hundreds of thousands of soldiers to suffer, slowed major campaigns, and even cost them strategic opportunities. And within that silence was also an admission. Sometimes the enemy cruel and hateful as they were understood the realities of war more ruthlessly and more accurately. In the midst of the crisis, the British were the first to correct course. By 1943, British factories began mass-producing the original spec jerry can, using the full German design without omitting a single detail. Recessed welds, a long integrated vent tube, and corrosion-resistant interior coating. When these cans arrived in North Africa, they immediately transformed the logistics situation. Fuel loss dropped sharply. Refueling speed increased. Mechanized columns began operating smoothly again, and for the first time since 1941, Telohis' balance of the desert tilted toward the Allies. One British officer wrote in his war diary, "We don't need more tanks, we just need cans that don't leak." For the United States, the shock came later. They continued producing rolled seam cans, alongside welded ones, because the entire production chain couldn't be reversed in just a few months. As a result, even in the 1944 European campaign, American cans continued causing trouble. 3.5 million were lost, abandoned along roadsides, repurposed as seats, steps, or stacked into makeshift walkways across the mud of Normandy. At one point, an American general snapped, "We don't lack gasoline. We lack something to put it in. Manuel. General Patton, the commander who understood speed better than anyone, tested one of his bitterest setbacks. Fitterest Betty weakness. When his lightning advance across France stalled at Metz, he roared, "Give me 400,000 gallons of gasoline, and I'll drive straight through Germany." But the gasoline existed sitting safely in depots. There simply weren't enough good cans to bring it to the front. By the end of the war, when official reports were compiled, the Allies finally understood the most brutal truth of all. One small detail, a decision about a weld seam, had cost them millions of gallons of fuel, thousands of marching hours, and countless strategic opportunities. The final Allied victory did nothing to diminish the scale of the mistake. If anything, it made the lesson clearer. Modern war isn't decided only by tanks, aircraft, or generals. It is decided by the mundane, overlooked objects that keep armies moving. Fuel cans, wheels, bolts, weld, the things most easily dismissed. As minor details can become the difference between a lightning advance and a grinding stalemate, between a successful campaign and a disaster. After the war, NATO standards officially abandoned the American rolled seam design and reverted to the original 1937 German pattern, almost unchanged. Modern jerry cans found on military vehicles, aid convoys, UN logistics hubs, or scientific expeditions still carry the legacy of Vincenz, the German engineer who understood that war does not tolerate carelessness, and that every curve, every sheet of steel, every weld exists for a reason. With nearly 90 years of history, the jerrycan stands as a symbol of a timeless truth. In war, victory or defeat sometimes hinges not on grand decisions but on someone who truly understands the weight of a small detail.